What if the command to sit was answered with a standing ovation? That's what a black woman faced when a judge barked at her to sit down, dismissing her as if respect could be ordered away. The gavel froze mid-air when the entire court stood up to salute her instead. It became a viral courtroom moment remembered far beyond the walls of that courthouse. Imagine this, a courtroom so still that even the hum of the fluorescent lights feels like a verdict. Polished wood gleams under harsh bulbs, benches stand in rigid rows, and every breath lingers too long, as if held hostage by judgment. Then a voice cracks through the silence, sharp, commanding, absolute. Sit down. The words slice toward her like a blade. A black woman, standing not just for herself, but for every door that had ever slammed shut before she reached it, feels the weight of the order. The judge does not raise his gavel. He doesn't need to. His voice alone has been sharpened by centuries of tradition that has so often demanded silence when dignity tried to speak. It was another chapter in black discrimination stories and the long history of stories of injustice. She does not move. For a heartbeat, her stillness is louder than the command. Eyes flicker across the room. Some jurors look away. Others smirk faintly, hiding behind lowered gazes. The clerk shuffles papers too loudly, trying to disguise unease. But the silence is thick. It is not absence. It is complicity. Her name is not whispered in that moment. She is the defendant, the woman. The courtroom strips names away, replacing them with labels easier to dismiss. But her story stretches across everyday racism examples and untold black stories, where silence was used as a weapon. Today it is different. Her silence carries defiance. The judge leans back slightly, eyes narrowing. His robe hangs like a shadow over the bench. He says again, slower this time, sit, down. Each word drops like a hammer. But his authority wavers, because this time, the silence begins to fracture. She whispers back, I am standing. The room shifts. The gallery senses the courtroom twist, and soon the silence breaks. Not in laughter or dismissal, but in solidarity, as the entire court stood up for her. Neighbor says, don't lean there. That's not yours. Her friend dropped her gaze, shuffled backward. She stood still, her hands pressed to the fence as if it could hold her up. She replies softly, it's just wood. The silence after that reply was heavier than the words. Her friend never came back to play on her side. The fence had done its job, divided, excluded, reminded. Years later, those same invisible fences followed her into classrooms. She sat in the front row, raising her hand, knowing the answer. The teacher scanned the room, eyes gliding past her to land on someone else. Again and again. The chalk scratched against the board, erasing not only equations but her presence. She could feel the same boundaries drawn, only now without wood. This was silence as a fence, harder to see, harder to prove, but just as impenetrable. At work, the pattern repeated. Her desk sat by the window, sunlight pouring across her notes. But meetings cast her into shadow. Ideas she voiced were met with nods, followed minutes later by someone else repeating them louder. And suddenly, the room applauded. She would sit there, hands folded, biting back words she knew wouldn't be heard. Colleagues smiled politely at her in the halls, the same way her neighbors once had across the fence. Courteous, restrained, but never welcoming. Invisible boundaries marked every space she entered. But if fences taught her exclusion, they also taught her defiance. Each board she leaned against as a child, each silence she endured as a student, each dismissal she faced at work carved something deeper in her: resilience. She began to see fences not as walls, but as mirrors, reflecting the fears of those who built them. One evening, she walked past her old neighborhood. The fence was still there, its paint now chipped, boards warped by weather. Children played nearby, their laughter spilling across yards without noticing the boundary. She paused, touching the wood. What once stood like iron in her memory now felt fragile, almost breakable. She whispered to herself, as if answering the voice from years before. She says, it's still just wood. But the weight of those fences never left her. They traveled with her into the courtroom, invisible yet towering. When the judge ordered her to sit, she felt every board press against her ribs, every whispered reminder of where she belonged. To obey would mean to rebuild those fences inside herself. To refuse was to break them, one by one. And so, even as the courtroom waited for her submission, her stance carried the memory of every boundary she had endured. She stood not only against the judge, but against the echo of every fence that had ever dared to tell her, "You do not belong here." The silence in that courtroom was the same silence that followed her childhood laughter, her raised hand in classrooms, her stolen ideas at work. But this time, she was no longer willing to be held by it. This time, the fence would not stand. The courtroom was more than a chamber of justice. It was a stage. Every polished surface gleamed like scenery, every robe and uniform a costume rehearsed for centuries. The judge sat elevated, his bench like a throne carved from law and tradition. The jurors lined one side, rigid and expressionless, cast as silent observers. And behind her, the gallery filled with bodies who had paid no ticket but carried the weight of an audience, watching, whispering, judging. She felt the script pressing down on her. In this play, her role had been written long before she walked through the doors. She was meant to be small, compliant, an interruption smoothed away by procedure. She was not meant to command attention, only to absorb judgment. The judge leaned forward, speaking as though the courtroom lights burned brighter when his voice filled the air.
Judge says, "This is not a forum for speeches."
"Sit and let the process continue." His tone wasn't a request. It was a performance, as if each word were rehearsed lines in a role too well practiced to falter. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The silence that followed was almost scripted. She could feel the audience waiting for her cue, but she did not deliver the role expected. She stayed standing. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some crossed their arms, others scribbled meaningless notes, pretending to study the evidence rather than the defiance unfolding before them. Yet not one spoke. Their silence was as thick as curtains closing on a scene. Behind her, the gallery murmured softly. Someone coughed, another shuffled, but no voice rose. They were extras in this theater, present to fill the space, not to change the story. The bailiff stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. His presence was meant to intimidate, another prop in the performance of authority. His hand rested near his belt, but not on it, just enough to remind her, and everyone else, that power had muscle behind it. She inhaled deeply, feeling the air scrape her throat. The courtroom reeked of ritual, the shuffle of papers, the deliberate clearing of throats, the judge's voice ricocheting off the walls. Everything was designed to keep order, to remind those inside that authority belonged here, not dignity. She thought of how many had stood in this same room before her, how many had been cast into silence by the same lines, the same roles. It was not new. It was theater repeated endlessly, and the audience had learned to watch without ever interrupting. But even theater has its cracks. The longer she stood, the more the performance faltered. The judge repeated himself, each time louder, each time thinner in confidence. The jury scribbled nonsense more urgently, hiding eyes they didn't want to meet. The gallery's whispers grew restless, as though the extras might forget their lines and break into something unscripted, and she, still standing, became the disruption. Not a performer, not an extra, but the unscripted force that threatened to tear down the stage itself. She finally spoke, her voice low but cutting through the air. She says, "If this is your stage, then why does truth have no role?" A gasp shivered through the gallery. The judge's lips pressed into a hard line. He had the lines, the costume, the throne. But for the first time, the stage no longer felt secure. The performance wavered, the script forgotten. Silence filled the cracks, not as complicity but as tension. Something was changing. The stage was no longer theirs alone. The courtroom pressed in around her, yet her mind slipped away, backward, to echoes that refused to stay buried. Each moment here was stitched to a memory, a thread of silencing that trailed from her past into this trial. She saw herself again in a classroom, small hand raised high, fingers aching to be noticed. The question was simple, the answer clear, but the teacher's eyes drifted past her as though she were invisible. Another student was chosen, fumbling through the response she had known all along. Her hand lowered slowly, shame prickling her skin. The silence of that classroom was not empty. It was a verdict. Your voice does not matter here. Years later, she remembered a lecture hall. The professor had asked for interpretations of a passage. She spoke, offering clarity that wove text into life. Her words floated briefly in the air before vanishing, swallowed by the next raised voice, a classmate who echoed her idea, nearly word for word. Applause followed, praise directed to him. She sat quietly, heart heavy with the same familiar weight. Silence pressed against her chest, again and again, rehearsing her for this very moment. At work, the pattern deepened. Meetings blurred together with the same scene. She would speak, her tone steady but overlooked, her insight met with nods that quickly faded. Minutes later, someone else would reshape her words, louder, less precise, but suddenly powerful. The room leaned toward him, applauded, moved forward. She remained, her contribution erased, her presence acknowledged only in courtesy, not credit. She remembered one particular meeting. She had outlined a proposal, carefully researched, polished with details. The supervisor nodded but moved on quickly. Later, when another colleague repeated her suggestion, laughter and admiration followed. She sat there, silent, fighting the burn behind her eyes. She had learned silence was not just imposed. It was rehearsed, reinforced, recycled until it became expectation. Now, in this courtroom, every interruption from the bench carried the same echo. The judge's clipped words felt like the teacher's dismissive glance, the professor's blindness, the supervisor's theft. It was not one command. It was a lifetime of them, condensed into 2 words. Sit down. She clenched her fists at her sides, steadying herself. Memory was not weakness, it was evidence. Evidence of a pattern too sharp to ignore, too cruel to be coincidence. The jury scribbled on notepads, pretending not to watch. Their silence mirrored the silence of classmates who never defended her, colleagues who never credited her. The gallery's quiet indifference was the same as neighbors who whispered instead of welcoming. She turned her head slightly, scanning the faces behind her. Some stared blankly, others fidgeted, a few shifted uncomfortably when her eyes met theirs. Not one voice rose. The silence was louder than the gavel that waited on the bench. Her voice finally broke the stillness, not loud, but enough to echo her past. She says, "I have been spoken over all my life. Today, I will not be erased." The words fell heavy, resonating in the space like a stone in still water. For a brief second, the echoes of classrooms, workplaces, neighborhoods aligned perfectly with this room. The judge's jaw clenched, but his authority felt thinner, as if her defiance stripped the robe of its weight. She knew now that her stance was more than defiance. It was every silenced moment resurrected, every erased word restored. Each echo had led here, and for the first time, she was not lowering her hand, not shrinking into silence, not letting the applause belong to someone else. The echoes of her past had become the foundation of her stand. And the courtroom, whether it wanted to or not, would have to hear them. At first it was just a whisper, barely audible, almost ashamed of itself. A cough, a shuffle of feet, the quiet creak of a bench. But silence has cracks, and once it begins to fracture, it cannot be mended. Her refusal to sit was no longer confined to the courtroom's 4 walls. Eyes darted, hands shifted toward pockets. The glow of cell phones flickered in the back rows. Screens tilted just enough to capture what words could not. Someone pressed record. The camera lens trembled as it zoomed in. The small rebellion crystallized into pixels, a woman standing when ordered to bend. The recording was not polished, not professional. It was raw, alive, charged with a tension that no gavel could erase. The whispers grew. A teenager in the gallery leaned toward his mother. Teenager whispers, "She's not sitting." The mother pressed her lips together, glancing nervously at the judge, then back at the woman. No reply came. The silence itself seemed to tremble. Within minutes, the video slipped beyond the courtroom, carried like a spark into dry grass. Phones buzzed quietly in pockets. Notifications pinged faintly, a sound quickly hushed but impossible to contain. The first upload hit the stream with a caption, "Judge tries to silence her." She refuses. Outside on sidewalks and in living rooms, The whispers became louder than the gavel inside. A clip of her steady stance spread faster than the trial itself, shared not for legal interest, but for the audacity of her defiance. Back inside the courtroom, she didn't know yet how far her image had traveled. She only felt the weight of eyes, some hostile, some curious, some wavering between fear and admiration. Every second she remained standing deepened the fracture in silence. The judge's face flushed, as though sensing control slipping from his grasp. His fingers drummed the bench, sharp little bursts of impatience. Judge says, "This is a court of law. Obey its order." But her refusal had already multiplied beyond his authority. Phones buzzed again, whispers moved faster, and somewhere beyond these walls, thousands of strangers watched her silence transform into spectacle. She breathed slowly, refusing to bow. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they were still spectators or unwilling participants in something larger. One man leaned forward, phone low in his lap, recording still. The glow lit his knuckles as he whispered to himself. Man whispers, "History's happening." The woman could not hear him, but she could feel it. The shift in the air. The way silence no longer felt like complicity alone, but like suspense, waiting to break. For years she had been erased in classrooms, overlooked in meetings, dismissed by neighbors. Those moments had never traveled further than the walls that contained them. But this moment was different. The fence of silence was splintering under the weight of technology, of whispers, of witnesses unwilling to let it vanish. The judge leaned closer, his voice a low growl masked in official language. Judge says, "One more word and you'll be held in contempt." Her answer came, steady, defiant. She says, "Then let it be contempt for silence." The words were caught by more than ears. They were etched into recordings echoing beyond the courtroom. Outside, her defiance had already become a headline, a spark in feeds, scrolling endlessly. Inside, silence deepened, but now it vibrated. Not complicity, but tension. Whispers spread faster than fear. And resistance, once fragile, began to feel inevitable. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, not with justice, but with humiliation. The judge's face tightened, his patience unraveling. What began as an order had now become a battle for dominance. Every second she refused to sit was an indictment of his authority, a spotlight on cracks he could not afford to show. His gavel slammed once, sharp and hollow, echoing across the walls. Judge says, "This court will not be disrupted. You are ordered to comply." The words weren't just directed at her. They were broadcast to the room. He wanted the gallery to see his power, the jury to know who commanded the stage. Yet the more he pressed, the more fragile his grip appeared. Her body remained steady, though her heart pounded. She knew this wasn't just about her dignity. It had become theater of humiliation. He wanted submission not for order, but for spectacle. He needed her silence to remind everyone else of their own. The gallery shifted. People leaned forward, breaths shallow. Some looked at the floor, unwilling to witness what was unfolding. Others stared openly, caught between fear of authority and awe of defiance. The silence was no longer passive. It was suffocating, electric, waiting to ignite. The bailiff stepped closer, shoes striking like a warning drumbeat. His presence loomed at her side, shadow spilling over her feet. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his proximity screamed the threat. The next act could be force. She drew in a breath, her voice firm. She says, "Respect cannot be forced by fear." The words carried farther than intended. A murmur rippled across the gallery, quickly silenced but undeniable. The judge's jaw clenched tighter. He had expected compliance, perhaps even tears, but not a defiant sentence that rang louder than his gavel. The storm inside the court swelled. What should have been a routine display of authority was unraveling before his eyes. He slammed the gavel again, louder this time, desperate to mask the cracks. Judge says, "One more word, and I will hold you in contempt." She met his eyes, unflinching. She says, "Then let contempt speak louder than silence." The gallery gasped, small, sharp breaths sucked in all at once. For a heartbeat, even the bailiff froze. The authority in robes and benches felt suddenly fragile, stretched thin against the weight of her defiance. The humiliation meant for her was turning. Each attempt to diminish her only exposed his desperation. Each order shouted louder than the last, each threat emptier than before. The power he wielded began to feel performative, not absolute. Behind her, someone whispered. Voice whispers, "She's winning without moving." The words slipped into the air like prophecy. She remained standing, her silence and defiance intertwined, while the judge's fury grew visible. His hand gripped the gavel too tightly, knuckles pale. His robe, once majestic, now seemed to swallow him, the fabric heavy, suffocating. The storm was no longer outside. It had broken inside these walls. Not thunder, not lightning, but humiliation turned public. Authority was tightening its grip, but the tighter it squeezed, the more its power slipped through. The judge's voice was loud, but beneath it, she could hear something older, an echo that stretched far beyond these walls. It was the same command spoken in countless ways across centuries, always sharpened to a single message: know your place. The courtroom was only the newest stage for that chorus. She felt the weight of laws once written to deny her ancestors seats at tables, access to schools, entry into neighborhoods. Those laws had been struck from paper, but their shadows still whispered in spaces like this. When the gavel fell, it wasn't just him speaking. It was the echo of every system designed to shrink her, every chain disguised as order. Her eyes flickered across the jury. Their silence was not ignorance, it was inheritance. Generations had taught them to watch quietly while authority demanded obedience from those who looked like her. That silence wasn't neutral. It was heavy with history, each unsaid word carrying the same message: stay small, stay quiet. She remembered walking through a library as a girl, shelves towering above her. Knowledge stretched farther than her arms could reach, yet even there, whispers followed her down the aisles. The same echo, know your place. She remembered her first job interview, seated across from a panel whose smiles carried pity rather than opportunity. Their rejection letter came days later, wrapped in courtesy but humming the same tune. Know your place. And now, in this courtroom, the echo was loudest of all. The judge leaned forward, his voice like thunder masked in legal language. Judge says, defiance will not be tolerated here. But she heard something different. She heard chains rattling through his words, chains polished and disguised, but chains nonetheless. He did not speak only for himself. He spoke for the system that had birthed him, the system that armored him in robes and placed a gavel in his hand. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, but she refused to bow. She thought of ancestors who had stood taller with less, who had faced harsher rooms with no gallery to witness them. Their blood hummed in her veins, a reminder that defiance was not new, but inherited. She lifted her chin, her words steady. She says, my place is where justice stands. The courtroom shuddered in silence. It was more than defiance. It was lineage breaking through her voice. The bailiff shifted uneasily, as though hearing not just her, but the history that stood behind her. The jury scribbled harder, though none could erase the tremor her words left in the air. The gallery leaned forward, pulled into the moment, the silence no longer passive but charged with memory. The judge tightened his grip on the gavel, but even he seemed to sense it. The chains had slipped. His command was not absolute. His threats sounded brittle. His power was no longer unquestioned. The echoes of the past had been summoned into this room, but instead of binding her, they had begun to break. Each order he barked carried less weight, while every word she spoke drew strength from centuries of survival. And though the silence lingered, it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to history, to her, to the storm building with every breath. The command came again, louder, sharper, a strike meant to end defiance. Judge says, sit down, now. His voice cracked like a whip, but instead of submission, it sparked something combustible in the air. The gallery stiffened, the jury shifted in their seats, the bailiff edged closer. It was the same command as before, yet now it no longer carried certainty. It sounded desperate, trembling at the edges, as if the very foundation of the bench beneath him were shaking. She stood taller. Her shoulders squared, her hands steady at her sides. Her chest rose with a deep breath that carried centuries of refusal, centuries of unfinished sentences, of silenced voices. When she exhaled, the air itself seemed to change. For a long heartbeat, she said nothing. And in that silence, something cracked. It was not her. It was the silence of the room. A cough broke it first, sharp and nervous. Then a whisper, quickly hushed. The creak of a chair echoed like thunder in the tension. The silence that had once weighed down the courtroom no longer felt like complicity. It felt unstable, like glass under pressure, ready to shatter. The judge's eyes narrowed. He gripped his gavel, slamming it down. The sound reverberated across the room, a hollow attempt to regain control. Judge says, "Order in the court." But order was already slipping. She raised her chin, her voice steady, calm, dangerous in its composure. She says, "I will not sit, not for your comfort, not for your silence." The words landed with the weight of a verdict. The gallery gasped collectively, not loud, but enough to ripple across the benches like wind across tall grass. The jury froze, pens still in hand, their eyes darting between her and the bench. The bailiff hesitated, his body taut with conflict. Protocol told him to move to enforce, but something in the air, something undeniable, held him still. The judge's voice wavered now, not in words but in tone. His authority, once unquestioned, faltered. He repeated himself, but the repetition betrayed him. Judge says, "Sit down." Each word, once sharp, now sounded dull. Each syllable less command and more plea. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She says, "How many times have you told the truth to sit down? How many doors have you closed with those words? How long will silence be your verdict?" The gallery leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats. For the first time, silence did not shield him. It shielded her. The judge slammed his gavel again, but it cracked faintly, the wood striking harder than it could withstand. A small split appeared near its head, subtle, symbolic, yet undeniable. Authority itself was fracturing in his hand. She did not flinch. She did not bow. She stood, her stillness louder than his thunder. The silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, to the moment, to the storm gathering in every heart that witnessed it. Behind her, someone rose halfway from their seat before hesitating. Another leaned forward as though ready to move. The gallery was restless, no longer an audience but a crowd teetering on the edge of choice. The judge's voice cracked finally, thin under the strain. Judge says, "This is my court." "My rules." Her reply was quiet, but it detonated. She says, "Then your rules are broken." The silence shattered. A wave of murmurs surged across the gallery, too many to silence, too many to ignore. The room buzzed with the tremor of awakening. The storm, long foreshadowed, had finally broken. The judge pounded his gavel again, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the crowd, gasps, whispers, the scrape of benches as people shifted. Authority no longer commanded the room. Defiance did. And in that charged air, in that suspended second, the courtroom stood on the brink. The command meant to end resistance had become the catalyst for something far larger. Silence, once complicit, had cracked, and nothing would return it to stillness again. The judge's command still echoed, but it no longer carried authority. It lingered in the air like smoke, dissipating quickly, leaving only the acrid stench of desperation. All eyes fixed on her, still standing, unbroken, taller in spirit than the man who claimed dominion over the court. Her stance unsettled him. He shifted in his seat, robes rustling as though even the fabric betrayed his unease. His hand tightened around the gavel until his knuckles whitened. It trembled faintly, betraying the crack in his composure. The bench, once a throne, suddenly seemed small compared to the gravity of her defiance. The silence stretched again, not the silence of complicity, but of suspense. The gallery leaned forward waiting, their bodies restless, their breaths shallow. The storm had broken open, but everyone was holding still, caught between habit and history, unsure whether to side with power or with truth. The judge cleared his throat, his voice raw. Judge says, "I command respect. This court demands order." Her gaze never wavered. She says, "Respect is earned. Order is not silence." The words landed like stone against glass. The gavel shook slightly in his hand. He raised it again to strike, but in that moment a soft crack split the head further. A tiny splinter fell onto the bench, almost invisible, yet symbolic enough to draw the gallery's collective gasp. The pen of a juror slipped from her fingers, clattering against the desk with a sound far louder than it should have been. The judge flinched at the noise. Authority was slipping, no longer absolute, no longer untouchable. She stood motionless, but her stillness carried weight heavier than movement. It was the calm of mountains before an avalanche, the quiet strength of rivers that carved through stone. Each second she refused to bow amplified her presence. She was no longer simply a defendant. She was a mirror reflecting his fragility. The judge's voice faltered as he tried again. Judge says, "This is my bench. My word is final." Her answer cut clean through the air. She says, "Then your word has failed." Gasps erupted, sharp and undeniable. The jury exchanged glances, their pens forgotten. In the gallery, people shifted, shoulders brushing as though invisible lines that had kept them apart were dissolving. The bailiff's stance wavered. His hand hovered near his belt but stopped, caught between duty and conscience. The robe that cloaked the judge no longer looked majestic. It looked heavy, suffocating, a weight he could not carry. His authority, once towering, seemed to shrink in the shadow of her defiance. He was trembling, not visibly to all, but in subtle betrayals. The twitch of his lips, the crack in his voice, the gavel splintering in his grasp. She inhaled slowly, each breath deliberate, each second of silence bending the courtroom further toward her. She says, "You told me to sit. I will stand until justice does." The words silenced even the murmurs. The crowd froze, stunned into stillness. Her defiance wasn't noise. It was clarity, sharp and unshakable. The judge tried once more, but his voice cracked, the words tumbling unevenly. Judge says, "If you continue." He stopped himself, unable to finish. The authority in his voice had bled out, leaving only the hollowness of a man unmasked. The bench seemed smaller now. She seemed taller. The balance had shifted. What once looked like defiance now looked like truth, and his collapse had already begun, not with a fall, but with the trembling of a voice, the splintering of wood, the breaking of silence. The crowd sensed it. Their breaths grew heavier, their posture straighter. The room was no longer owned by him. It was held by her. And in that moment, the court felt less like his domain and more like hers. The silence that followed was not the same silence that had suffocated her when she first entered. This silence trembled, restless, alive with the sound of shifting hearts. It was the silence before a chorus, the breath before a crowd learns it has a voice. The gallery was no longer frozen in complicity. A gasp had already escaped when her words cut through the judge's claim of finality. Now more murmurs rippled across the benches, small currents carrying through the stillness. The storm inside the courtroom had not reached its peak, but the air was humming with its arrival. One woman in the gallery leaned forward, her hands gripping the pew until her knuckles whitened. She whispered to the man beside her. Woman whispers, "She's right." The man glanced nervously toward the bailiff, then back to the woman still standing. He didn't answer, but his silence was no longer indifference. It was consideration. The jurors, too, were shifting. One tapped his pen nervously, another kept glancing toward the judge as though seeking reassurance that never came. The pen clattered again to the floor, its sound echoing like punctuation in the tension. The judge tried to press his weight back into the room. Judge says, "This court will remain under control. Do not forget yourselves." But the words sounded hollow, empty of conviction. They collided with a room that was no longer his. Each syllable faded quickly, swallowed by murmurs that refused to be silenced. She stood rooted, unmoving. Her strength was not loud, but it was unshakable. She had become the axis around which the room now spun. Every eye was drawn to her, not the bench. Every heartbeat seemed aligned with hers. Someone in the back coughed, then muttered under his breath. Voice murmurs, "She's not afraid." Another picked up the thread. Second voice murmurs, "Neither should we be." The words carried forward like sparks in dry air. The gallery's posture changed, spines straightened, shoulders lifted. Small noises of defiance, shifting seats, the scrape of shoes, grew into a collective rhythm. The judge slammed his gavel again, but this time the crack was louder than before. The wood had split further, his authority fracturing with it. His eyes darted across the room, but for the first time he saw not obedience, but restlessness, not silence, but awakening. Her voice came again, measured, steady. She says, "Order cannot live where truth is denied." The gallery erupted, not in shouts, not yet, but in a swell of sound. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of movement. It was not rebellion, but it was no longer submission. The silence, once his greatest weapon, was gone. The bailiff looked uncertain, his stance broken by hesitation. He shifted his weight, glancing at the gallery as if realizing he was outnumbered. The power dynamic had tilted, subtly but undeniably. A young man in the front row whispered, loud enough to be heard. Young man whispers, "Why should she stand alone?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Heads turned, glances exchanged. A ripple of recognition spread, an understanding that their silence had chained them as much as it had tried to chain her. The first shuffle of feet came then. A woman halfway down the bench adjusted her seat as if preparing to rise. Another cleared his throat, no longer masking the sound. The gallery was transforming from an audience into a chorus, each small noise blending into something larger. The judge's face paled. He slammed the gavel again, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the living noise of the room. The more he struck, the more fragile he appeared. Authority was crumbling under the weight of its own echoes. She remained still, yet the room moved around her. What began as a solitary defiance was becoming collective. The silence that had once suffocated her was now breaking apart, piece by piece, replaced by the sound of people finding their voices again. And though no one had yet stood fully, the courtroom was already rising, not in bodies but in spirit. The chorus had begun, and it would not be silenced. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. The gallery murmured, restless, voices colliding in hushed tones. The judge slammed his gavel, but each strike rang weaker, swallowed by the rising hum of defiance. His robe looked less like authority now and more like a costume fraying under the lights. She remained still, anchored, steady, unbroken. But behind her something stirred. A young man near the front shifted forward. His knees bent, then straightened. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. For a second, he stood alone, his body trembling with both fear and courage. The room noticed. The sound of the bench creaking beneath him echoed louder than the judge's gavel. The judge's head snapped in his direction. Judge says, "Sit down immediately." But the man did not move. He looked forward, his chin lifted, his eyes locked not on the bench, but on the woman who still stood. His silence was no longer complicity, it was solidarity. A heartbeat later, another rose. A woman in the back, her hands pressed to her chest, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. She said nothing, but her stance screamed louder than words. She would not sit while truth was forced down. The sound of feet scraping echoed like thunder now. One by one, the gallery stood. The old and the young, strangers and neighbors, hesitant at first but then certain. The creak of benches became a chorus of defiance, everybody rising like a wave against the tide of authority. The jury shifted too. One man rose slowly, his chair groaning under the weight of decision. Another followed. Soon half of them were on their feet, their silence transformed into recognition. The judge's face flushed crimson. His gavel slammed again, harder, splinters flying from the cracked wood. Judge says, "This is contempt. You will all sit down." But the gavel no longer commanded fear. It sounded like desperation. She inhaled, her voice calm, unshaken. She says, "You cannot order dignity to bow." The words ignited the room. The gallery, now fully standing, swelled with energy. Murmurs turned into something heavier, like the rumble before thunder. Though they spoke no chants, their silence had changed. It was no longer heavy with complicity. It was heavy with unity. The bailiff froze. For the first time, his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He was one man facing dozens now, the tide too strong to contain. He lowered his hand from his belt, stepping back slightly, as if to say, "I will not fight this wave." The judge's voice cracked as he tried again. Judge says, "I am the law here." Her reply shattered the last illusion of control. She says, "You are not the law. You are its shadow." The words echoed louder than the gavel ever had. The gallery gasped, then fell into profound silence, a silence of revelation, not fear. And then, almost as one, the entire courtroom stood taller. Not a single body remained seated. It was not rebellion. It was recognition. A collective salute, not to her alone, but to what she represented, the truth that could not be ordered into silence. The judge's gavel slipped from his grip, striking the bench with a dull thud. His authority, once absolute, lay fractured in wood and silence. The crowd's unity filled the space where his power had crumbled. She remained standing at the center, but now she was no longer alone. The fences of silence had fallen, the doors of fear had swung open, and the courtroom had risen, not for him, but for her. The climax had arrived, not in violence, not in chaos, but in the quiet thunder of a collective stand. When the storm passed, the air in the courtroom was unrecognizable. It was no longer the suffocating silence that had greeted her when she entered, nor the tense murmurs that had built with each defiant word. It was something new, still, but alive, as if the very walls had taken a breath for the first time. The judge sat slumped, his robe heavy, his gavel splintered on the bench. His words, once sharp enough to slice through air, now hung dull, forgotten. Around him, the authority of the bench seemed smaller than ever. The gallery, though silent again, was not the same crowd that had watched passively before. Their posture was taller, their eyes unflinching. They had risen, and though they now sat once more, the echo of that collective stand still charged the air. Silence had shifted. It no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to dignity. The courtroom doors, thick and heavy, groaned faintly as a draft passed through. For years, they had symbolized separation between power and people, between those who passed freely and those left outside. But today they felt different. They no longer stood as barriers. They seemed open, even when closed. She stood still, her chin high, her breath steady. She had not needed to shout, had not needed to fight with fists or fury. Her refusal had been enough to open doors long thought immovable. A juror adjusted his papers, but his eyes lingered on her, as if silently acknowledging a truth he could not erase. In the gallery, a young man held his phone close to his chest, recording off. Yet the glow of the screen reminded her the world beyond these doors had already seen what happened here. The storm would not stay contained. The bailiff stepped back into the corner, his shoulders lowering as though relieved he hadn't enforced the command. Even he knew some doors once opened could never be shut again. She turned slightly, her eyes tracing the courtroom. The benches, the walls, the very air had witnessed a shift. The storm had not destroyed the court. It had revealed it.
Stripped of pretense, stripped of shadows, the courtroom stood vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, truth finally had space to breathe. The doors at the back creaked louder as a clerk pushed them gently open.
Light spilled into the room, thin but steady. For the first time, the doors did not feel like guardians of exclusion. They felt like invitations. She inhaled, her voice quiet, yet clear enough to ripple across the space. She says, "These doors will not close again." And though no one answered, the silence itself seemed to agree. The trial ended, but its echoes followed her home. Long after the gavel fell for the final time, she walked through streets that looked the same, yet felt different. The air carried whispers of her defiance, carried through recordings and retellings,
spreading further than the courthouse steps. She passed by the old fences of her childhood, the same wooden boards.
Their paint chipped now, weathered by years. Once they had felt immovable, boundaries carved into her life, telling her where she could belong and where she could not. But now, they looked smaller, less threatening, like relics of a world she had already outgrown. She ran her fingers along the wood. Where cracks had splintered, she imagined paint. Not white this time, not a disguise for exclusion, but colors that spoke of renewal. Courage had redrawn the boundaries. Children played nearby, their laughter spilling across yards without hesitation. None of them paused at the fence line. Their games blurred the boundaries once guarded so tightly. She watched them chase each other, free of the invisible rules that had once pressed against her chest. For the first time, she saw not division but possibility. At work, she noticed changes too. A colleague who once repeated her ideas now paused, waited, and then said clearly in a meeting, "Colleague says," that was her idea. It was small, perhaps insignificant to others, but to her it was proof. The storm in that courtroom had spilled outward. The fences that once defined her life were being repainted, not with wood and nails, but with recognition, with dignity. Even the way people looked at her shifted. Neighbors who once whispered now nodded openly. Strangers stopped her, their words quiet but heavy with meaning. Stranger says, "You stood for all of us." She carried those words carefully. She had not stood for recognition. She had stood because the weight of silence was heavier than the risk of defiance. But now she understood. Courage was contagious. The fences of society, built to keep her out, had been redrawn. They were not gone, not yet. Some still loomed, hidden in shadows, in offices, in unspoken rules. But they no longer stood unchallenged. They no longer stood unquestioned. As she walked away from that old wooden fence, she whispered to herself. She says, "It's still just wood." And this time the words no longer carried bitterness. They carried power. The silence that once crushed her was gone. In its place came something she had never expected inside a courtroom. Applause. It hadn't erupted all at once, but in waves, hesitant at first, then bold, then unstoppable. When the first clap echoed, sharp and uncertain, the judge froze. He looked out as though the sound itself was rebellion. But one clap became two, then a dozen, then dozens more until the courtroom swelled with it. Hands striking together, breaking centuries of trained silence, shattering the ritual of obedience. She hadn't asked for applause. She hadn't demanded recognition. Yet as the sound filled the chamber, she understood it was not about her alone. It was about every silenced word, every stolen voice, every command to sit down that had gone unchallenged. The people were not clapping for her. They were clapping for truth, finally refusing to bow. The echo followed her beyond the walls. The applause spread through recordings, replayed on phones, shared in homes. A single defiance replayed endlessly, each time gathering strength. People who had never stepped into that courtroom felt it reverberate in their own lives, their own silences, at night, lying awake. She could still hear it, not the gavel, not the command, but the echo of hands refusing to be still. It lived in her chest like a drumbeat, steady, insistent. In the weeks after, she heard it again in unexpected places. In a classroom where a student raised her hand, the teacher finally paused, listened, and let her finish. In a meeting where a woman's idea was given space instead of stolen. In a neighborhood where whispers softened into greetings spoken aloud. The applause had ended in the courtroom, but its echo had not. It traveled like a current, carried in small acts, in new courage, in voices that once hid behind silence, now stepping forward. She remembered standing at the center of that storm, hearing nothing but her own heartbeat. Now that heartbeat had multiplied into thousands, carried through others who refused to let the moment fade. The silence had not only broken, it had been replaced by sound, by recognition, by echo. And echoes do not die easily. They cling to walls, to memories, to hearts unwilling to forget. She smiled once, softly, when asked what she remembered most from that day. It wasn't the judge's fury, or the gavel splintering, or even the collective stand. She says, "It was the sound after silence, and I knew it would never leave us." Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the judge's robe was folded away and the gavel discarded, her stand remained. Not in wood or stone, but in memory, in the lesson it carved into everyone who witnessed it. The truth was simple, yet it shook the pillars of authority. Dignity cannot be ordered to sit down. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had simply stood, refusing to bend where others had been forced to bow. In that act, she revealed what power often tries to hide, that authority without justice is fragile, that silence without consent is brittle, that dignity, once awakened, will not be erased. Her story transcended the courtroom. People carried it into their homes, into their schools, into their workplaces. Parents told their children. Teachers spoke it in classrooms. Strangers whispered it in buses and trains. Each retelling grew larger, not because her name mattered more than anyone else's, but because she represented something universal. For every person who had ever been told to shrink, to wait, to obey without question, her defiance became a mirror. They saw themselves in her refusal, in her words, in her silence that became strength. The symbols that haunted her, fences, doors, silence, had transformed. The fences were no longer barriers but markers of how far she had come. The doors no longer slammed shut but swung wide open, letting light in. The silence no longer suffocated. It was filled with applause, with echo, with voices no longer afraid. Even the courtroom, once a fortress of authority, stood changed in memory. Its doors could no longer close on truth. Its silence could no longer disguise complicity. Its bench could no longer rise higher than dignity. And so the lesson remained. Dignity is not granted by power. It is not bestowed by judges or crowds or systems. It is carried within, and once it refuses to bow, it reshapes the world around it. Her stand was singular, but its meaning was shared. It did not belong to her alone. It belonged to everyone who understood what it felt like to be silenced, dismissed, erased, and who longed for the courage to stand. Her words echoed still, quiet, but eternal. She says, "I will not sit, not for your comfort, not for your silence." The world heard them, and the world did not forget. Now the question remains, for those listening, for those watching, for those who carry their own silence like a weight. What will you do when the command comes for you? Will you bow, or will you stand? Drop your thoughts below. Share your voice.